reenactor. And for 36 years in the classroom, I used living history to jumpstart my students' interest in history, or at least hook them into the subject, because for many of them, at first they would feel that the subject was as dead as people we were studying. Well, I'm not in the classroom anymore, but I have an entire room at the house filled with garb that I would wear to do my lessons, to bring the history to life. And I still have a passion for doing that, resurrecting the past. I like to play history detective and amateur archaeologist, amateur anthropologist. And I have a desire to preserve landmarks. And what I'm engaged in is a very pretentious sounding mission Odyssey. And to that end, I'm visiting each of the missions, the asistancias, those are spin-off missions. The estancias, those are ranchos that supported the missions. The presidios, those are fortifications designed to protect the missions. And I'm doing it in garb, and I'm trying to document the story of each place. So what I'm doing right now is I am headed towards the Presidio at Monterey, and then I'll be going over to the Mission Carmel. But this would be the fortification that was set up to protect the second mission. Well, we're going to see what barriers have been thrown in the way, because the Presidio is on an active military installation, and this is the era of COVID. But we'll see what I can pull off. So I hope you stick with me on my journey. I did find the one part of the old Spanish Presidio that is not part of the current military base. These next few chapters are all intertwined with each other because they all center around Monterey Bay. And in 1542, 50 years after Columbus shows up in the New World, Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo is commanded to go north and explore the California coast. And he takes 3 ships, and he describes everything he's seeing, and he names a bunch of areas, landmarks, because he kind of wants to keep this straight in his head. And he gives very vivid descriptions of the native Californians and did population counts. And as he sailed north, a storm prevented him from seeing Monterey Bay as he traveled, and fog prevented him from seeing San Francisco Bay. He made it as far north as the Russian River, and he turned around, and this time he finds Monterey Bay, and describes it pretty thoroughly in his logs. Sails on. He's going to winter at San Miguel Island, and he and his crew run into trouble with the native Californians that are on the island, and Cabrillo breaks his shin, gets gangrene, dies, and is buried on the island. At least that's one account. But his logbook returns, and that's going to be of use later. Well, now, here it is, 1602, and we have someone else sailing forth with the information in the logbook, and this is Sebastián Vizcaíno, and he takes 3 ships, and he sails along, and he's kind of like renaming everything that Cabrillo made note of and gave names to, and he ends up finding Monterey Bay, right? He's found it the second time it's been discovered. Okay. And on December 17th, he comes ashore. And by January 3rd, he's taken a small party, including some Carmelite priests, and they end up finding a new river and a new bay, and it's named the Bay of Carmel. And okay, now we have some documentation there. And now Vizcaíno is going to sail south, and guess what? The Spanish aren't going to do anything with Alta California until 1769. On July 14th, 1769, Governor Portola leads what is referred to as his grand expedition. He takes 63 soldados de cuerda, leather jacket soldiers, and 100 mules and supplies packed on the mules and people to control the mules, and he marches north. And his goal, based upon the descriptions of Sebastián Vizcaíno's pilot, is to find the Bay of Monterey. And the descriptions don't match what he ends up seeing, or he doesn't interpret the descriptions correctly. And so he will end up returning south. While the expedition failed to find the Bay of Monterey, or at least recognize it, it did discover the Bay of San Francisco. But it's interesting that Padre Crespi, the diarist, wrote that they could not find, quote, the port of Monterey so celebrated and so praised in their time by men of character, skillful, intelligent, and practical navigators who came expressly to explore these coasts by order of the king. That they could not find the bay demonstrates Vizcaíno's exaggerations. And actually they did find it. They left a cross on a hill. They just didn't recognize where they were. Running low on supplies, they abandoned the quest and returned to San Diego in January of 1770. Padre Serra wanted Governor Portola to take another expedition north as soon as he returned from his earlier one, where he said he had failed to find the Bay of Monterey, but managed to discover a bunch of other stuff. So he took his expedition, went north, and a week before Padre Serra arrived, he and Father Crespi were looking around. They had arrived at the Bay of Monterey, and they found a cross they had erected before they left. Portola had never realized that he was actually at the bay, which must have been an interesting conversation in camp, with soldados going, do you want to tell him? I don't want to tell him. But they found the cross. The cross had been decorated with offerings. And on June 3rd, a week later, Mission Carmel was founded and the Presidio was founded for Monterey. And they were basically right next door to each other. King Carlos III of Spain has appointed José de Galvez as the Inspector General and has placed him in charge of the defense of New Spain. So basically it's going to be, in this case, Mexico and Alta California. More specifically, that's his territory. And he was also to discover the intent of the Russians and the British in North America. And the way Galvez ended up interpreting his orders was kind of like, okay, that means we have to stop them from advancing. And one of the major thrusts of what the Spanish ended up doing, it's Galvez's idea. It's not just going to be the missions, it's not going to be just pueblos, it's going to be presidios. There's going to be a military presence. But he knows that the presidios are not going to be strong enough on their own to stop foreign invaders. So he is actually thinking along the lines of including the native Californians and encouraging them to adopt the Spanish way of life. And the way that's going to work is Galvez wants to send married soldiers and their families to the Presidios, so that not only would the soldados have a really intense reason to defend defend the Presidios and defend the Spanish way of life, they would also be defending their families. But in the meantime, soldados and their families would serve as excellent examples of Christianity in the eyes of the Spanish, and that this would hopefully encourage more of the native Californians to join up. Establishing the Presidio in Monterey along with the mission was already a precedent. 1 year earlier, Padre Serra, over here, I'm at Presidio Hill in San Diego, the site of the original Presidio, created Mission San Diego, the Alcala, and at the same time the Presidio was erected. Okay, so here's our role model. In some ways, there's a bit of a difference between what went on at San Diego in building the mission and the Presidio at the same time, and the conditions over at Monterey. Because remember, San Diego, that takes place in 1769. The Monterey stuff is going on a year later. So there's a bit of a learning curve going on. But there's also a different environment. In the Presidio at San Diego, the soldados constructed their quarters out of brush and mud. In Monterey, there were forests nearby, and that helped a lot in the construction of the chapel, because you got to build the mission, but also the Presidio itself and the soldados' quarters, and they were considered almost luxurious compared to what the soldados in San Diego were living in. But there were problems when the San Diego mission and Presidio were established side by side. Those exact same problems are going to rear their heads up in Monterey. Turns out that the soldados, even with their families, were not the best of role models for the neophytes. Padre Serra used the excuse of, hey, the land's better, a little bit to the east, we'll move the mission. And so San Diego Mission gets another site. Portola had the Presidio built in Monterey, and it was on this site, and Padre Serra wanted the mission built here. And basically it's Mission San Carlos, everyone calls it Mission Carmel. And the first year things were okay, and then Portola left, and he left his second in command, Pedro Fages, in charge, and Padre Serra and Pedro Fages didn't play well together. Each seemed to think that he ought to be in charge of the mission. And after a while, Padre Serra realized, well, there's some other problems here too. The land isn't very good for growing crops. There's also not as many native Californians as he had wanted to be in the area in order to recruit. And quite frankly, he viewed the soldados as a very bad influence. So what he's going to end up on a bad influence on the neophyte women. And so he wanted the mission moved, and it would get moved to its present site. And the description that I'd heard was he wanted the mission within 2 gunshots of the shore. Just because the mission had moved to Carmel did not mean the Presidio was ignored. The chapel went through several incarnations, each larger than the last, going from being composed of logs standing on end to adobe. In the meantime, Monterey had been designated as the capital of California, and the governor rebuilt the Presidio, expanding the perimeter with adobe walls. Fire completely destroyed the original chapel in 1789, but by 1794 it had been rebuilt. The Royal Presidio Chapel of San Carlos de Borroméo de Monterey was closely associated with political activities in California. In addition to being used for religious services, which were attended by the Spanish governors, it was the scene of many colorful ceremonies that were part of the affairs of state. The facade and walls of the original chapel are intact. The front faces north and features a facade of carved sandstone which has ornate columns and a massive arched doorway. The interior is fairly plain, the whitewashed walls being decorated with only a few pictures and images of saints. The chapel reflects the handiwork of Mexican Indians who were imported to construct the building and whose renderings of religious motifs have survived as notable examples of art. Way too much information. So it looks like I'm coming back to tell the next chapter. I hope you stick with me on my journey.